I'm Alex Michelson. This week, the issue is homelessness.
Pride in this context, I mean, it's a big deal.
We're with Governor Newsom as he tries out new programs. How are they actually working? Also with us this week, Ron Brownstein of CNN and The Atlantic to weigh in on Governor Newsom's political moves. Plus, President Biden's future on a week he focused on student debt relief. How will that impact the midterms? And we discuss Ron's book, Rock Me on the Water, about how California changed our culture. The Issue Is starts right now.
Broadcasting across California, you're watching The Issue Is.
And welcome to The Issue Is. I'm Alex Michelson. You see him right there, Ron Brownstein standing by. We will talk to him in a moment, but let's begin this week with Governor Newsom. I was with him this week on multiple days talking about California's biggest issue of all, homelessness. Governor Gavin Newsom visits a first-of-its-kind pilot program to deliver services for the homeless. It's just steps from an encampment in downtown L.A.
We've got to bring government onto the streets. We've got to meet people where they are.
This statewide pop-up delivers health screenings, counseling, and COVID vaccines to those living on the streets, including to Kim Jameson and his dog.
Resources is what everybody needs.
The governor says many of the people working here recently set up a similar site at the McKinney fire in Northern California.
This is sponsored by the Office of Emergency Service. We're taking that model of benefits and we're bringing that now to the emergency that is homelessness in the state of California.
They say one of the most important spots here is what you're looking at right there from the DMV. Many people experiencing homelessness don't have IDs, and that can make other aspects of life very complicated.
Any of our staff can replicate this.
California's Transportation Secretary, Tokes Omashakin, is overseeing the ID program.
For access to anything, essentially, in state government, you're going to need an ID.
With so many of California's homeless addicted to drugs, they hand out overdose bags. What goes through your mind, the fact that you have to hand out an overdose bag to people on the streets of Southern California?
I mean, this is a symptom of our failure, not our success.
Those kits include tests for fentanyl.
We're here to save lives. We believe that every life is precious.
The governor says long-term, the idea is to get people away from sites like this and into permanent supportive housing sites like he also visited this week in Los Angeles. The governor here setting up a new apartment for someone who once experienced homelessness through his Project Home Key initiative. He gathers new items, helps make the bed, and writes a note, quote, "Welcome home, emphasis home. Congrats on the next phase of your life. The best is yet to come."
Pride in this context, I mean, it's a big deal.
The governor announcing nearly $700 million in new funds for Project Home Key, which will build 2,500 units like this one.
Create a pathway for solving the crisis of our time, homelessness.
The governor admits more than 150,000 Californians currently living on the street is unacceptable.
Decades of neglect led us to the conditions that we're experiencing today. Radical new strategies and approaches, and you should expect radically different results in the next few years.
Project Home Key started at the beginning of the pandemic, and at first the focus was on converting old hotels and motels. Now it's expanded to include places like this. Pico Square was supposed to be market-rate apartments. Now they'll be offering supportive services here, including those that are experiencing mental illness and drug addiction. The state pledging $83 million for operations, including social services. What kind of supportive services will they get at a place like this? And what do you say to people that are concerned about people who are struggling with those issues moving into their neighborhoods?
People don't want them in their backyard because they're nervous and scared about that. And one of the great things about the Room Key, Home Key model is the technical assistance that comes with it from the state.
So far, the state has pledged $3.75 billion overall for the Home Key program. He talked on camera for the first time about his decision to veto a bill that would have allowed safe drug injection sites for heroin in Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Francisco.
This is a commitment through this legislation for unlimited number of these sites with no plans that have been attached.
Do you like the concept?
Well, I've said this in the past. I've always been open. In fact, in the veto, made that point. But it's going to be on different terms than open-ended terms.
Vote yes on 27.
And he weighed in on Prop 27, an initiative to legalize sports betting that is blanketing the airwaves of California with ads claiming that the measure will help fight homelessness.
Perhaps that initiative will provide a few dollars. I'm not supporting or opposing it. I haven't even given a lot of thought. But it is not a homeless initiative.
Didn't sound like quite the endorsement there. Joining us now to discuss more is Ron Brownstein. You see him all the time on CNN. He is the author of Rock Me on the Water, which is available now in paperback. We'll go in depth on that book in a little bit. It's great. He's also the author of this piece for The Atlantic. It's entitled The Democrats' New Spokesperson in the Culture War. You see him right there, Governor Gavin Newsom. Ron, welcome to the issue. It's the first time.
Thanks for having me. Yep.
Where do you see Governor Newsom's place right now in the Democratic Party, and what do you make of his moves?
I think he's filling a vacuum in the Democratic Party, kind of the classic example of political entrepreneurship. There is enormous anxiety across the Democratic coalition, all the key groups, all the key constituencies, about the rollback of rights that is underway in many of the red states, Texas and Florida at the forefront of the list, abortion rights, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, book bans, classroom censorship. For a variety of reasons, Joe Biden isn't really comfortable being the point of the spear and pushing back on that. He has never really been much of a culture warrior to begin with, and his overall message is focused more on bringing the country together. And I think there was a feeling in the Democratic Party as the months went on, and DeSantis in Florida and Abbott in Texas were pursuing and passing this very aggressive agenda, that there was kind of no effective response. And I think Newsom, as a governor of California, and which carries, certain vulnerabilities and liabilities, but nonetheless gives him a very logical platform from which to be the voice saying, look, these people, these governors are going in the wrong direction. And I think he found a niche. And the evidence seems to be that he's filling the niche in a way that is raising his profile across the Democratic Party.
Well, and it seems like his favorite person to spar with is Ron DeSantis of Florida. Yeah. And just this week, he doubled down on that. He making a donation to Charlie Crist, the former Republican governor of Florida, who's now running as a Democrat, got the nomination this week and got a $100,000 donation from Gavin Newsom. Here's why the governor says he did that. Take a listen.
I like Charlie Crist, and I don't like bullies. You want to ask what my why is in life? I don't like bullies. I don't like people that demean people. I don't like people that talk down to people. I remember growing up, and folks would have their mouths washed out with soap if they talked like this. I got 4 kids. I don't want these guys being models. You're attacking LGBT community. You're attacking women. I hope others of you send money to send a message that if that's the future of the damn Republican Party, this country's in real trouble.
My grandmother once washed my mouth out with soap,
Really?
and it's not fun.
Yeah.
Not a good thing. What do you make of that? Pretty tough language there.
Yeah, look, if you want to be the Democrat to step into the ring with Ron DeSantis, there are going to be a lot of Democrats who say, let's go. He is the symbol of what's happening. We've talked about this before. We are watching basically a 60-year trend in American life move into reverse. I mean, starting in the 60s, what legal scholars call the rights revolution. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the contraception decision, the abortion decision, the ADA, Title IX, more rights were nationalized, and the ability of states to constrain those rights was reduced. And beginning over the last several years, we are seeing a concerted effort in the red states, with support from the Republican majority on the Supreme Court, to move back to a pre-1960s world where your basic rights depend much more on your zip code. And I think Newsom is pretty effectively establishing himself as a leader of Democrats who want to press that fight.
Is Gavin Newsom a legitimate presidential candidate?
If Biden doesn't run, I think he is a legitimate presidential candidate with the positioning and the lane that he has filled and the platform that he has. Obviously, there are other legitimate candidates. The predicate, though, is Biden not running. I mean, I don't think Gavin Newsom is going to challenge Biden. I'm not even sure he would challenge Kamala Harris, although I don't think that's impossible. But, the issue for Democrats is whatever is the sentiment in the party. Joe Biden believes that his final mission in American politics is to prevent Donald Trump from ever being president again. I think that is very clear to people in the White House. And as long as it seems likely that Donald Trump is going to run, it's going to be very hard to convince Joe Biden not to run. You know, and especially if, against all odds, this midterms ends up as being less of a red wave than everyone was expecting 4 to 6 months ago.
Well, we got to stop you there because we got to get a commercial break in. But when we come back, let's talk more about Joe Biden, about the midterms, about where things are at. It seems like things may be changing a little bit. More with Ron Brownstein right after this.
And will fix a badly broken system.
President Biden talking about forgiving student loans this week. The announcement forgives $10,000 of debt for those making under $125,000, $20,000 for Pell Grants. We're back with Ron Brownstein of The Atlantic. He's had a lot of legislative wins recently. How do you assess Joe Biden's performance right now?
He's gotten more done than seemed possible, certainly 6, 8 months ago, if not quite as much as they were hoping at the outset. But overall, you'd have to say in a 50-50 Senate, a 5-seat majority in the House, it's pretty remarkable how much they ended up getting across the finish line.
So where did that leave things for the midterms? All year long, there's been this thought of a red wave or a red tsunami, this idea that Republicans are almost certainly going to win the House, have a good chance of winning the Senate. Recently, even Mitch McConnell admitting that, you know, their chances of getting the Senate aren't that great because of candidate quality, which is some of the people endorsed by Trump candidates that Mitch McConnell didn't really like.
But he chose not to fight.
How do you see the state of play for that? Has there been a real change?
Clearly, there's been a change. I mean, you know, we are having kind of a split decision election. In the House, you know, there are only 4 times since the Civil War where the party out of power hasn't gained the 5 seats that Republicans would need to win the House. House races have grown to be more parliamentary. They're become somewhat more anonymous. They're more about the direction of the country, the president's approval rating, right track, wrong track. All of that makes it hard for Democrats to hold the House, even if the size of the gains aren't as, for Republicans, are not nearly as big as they were. And then when you get to the statewide elections, the larger factor is that you have Republican candidates who are essentially hand-selected by Trump in races like the Georgia and Arizona, Pennsylvania Senate races, the governor races in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. I think I got all those right. All of whom are struggling. And, you know, it's something interesting. A rational party, if that plays out this way, and Trump-endorsed candidates ultimately fall short in all 5 of the states that moved from Trump in 16 to Biden in 20, which are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where they could lose the governor race in all 3, Arizona, where they could lose both the governor and senator, and Georgia, where they could lose the senator. If that happens, a rational party would look at that and say, you know, maybe this is not the formula that is going to win back the states we need to get to 270. But what are the odds that Ron DeSantis or Mitch McConnell even would get up the day after the election and say, maybe this isn't the right path for us anymore?
Meaning Trump, who is hovering and has all this influence and seems to be growing influence with every criminal investigation into him.
Consolidating the base, even as the center recoils. That's what's happening.
All right. Well, up next, we want to go a little bit back in time to talk about your book, which is called Rock Me on the Water. So we go to break with some music from Jackson Browne. Rock Me on the Water.
Yes.
Rock me on the water, sister, you soothe my fever brow.
He had the answer to inflation. The country's got to produce more goods. Then we got to have a little more unemployment. So when there's more goods to buy and less people who can afford to buy the goods, then the prices will come down.
That was Archie Bunker on All in the Family in 1974, talking about the issue of inflation. I'm glad that inflation has gone away since then. We don't worry about that anymore. Our guest, Ron Brownstein, right here, has written a whole book about that landmark year, 1974. Here it is. There it is on the screen. Rock Me on the Water, 1974, the year Los Angeles transformed movies, music, television, and politics. Again, it's out in paperback now. There's a lot to get into here, but let's try to separate it a little bit. Let's start with my favorite thing, which is TV. Of course, we're in the TV business here. So back in 1974, you had All in the Family, which was talking about families in new ways on TV, also politics, of course. Mary Tyler Moore talked about women in the workplace in new ways. MASH talked about the Vietnam War. these shows were really talking about real issues that people cared about as compared to years before. It was all sort of fantasy land and escapism, right?
They lived in the same world as the viewers. I mean, Archie Bunker lived in the same world as the people watching the show. You know, and the basic story of Rock Me on the Water is that the pop culture produced in LA in the early 1970s, television, movies, and music, was the crucible in which the critique of American life that emerged out of all the social movements in the 1960s was kind of cemented into our consciousness, never to go away. Greater suspicion of business and government, you know, greater suspicion of authority, changing roles for women, changing relations between men and women.
Yeah, and then when it comes to movies, we had movies like Chinatown and the growing star power of Jack Nicholson, who was quite a player in the LA scene, too. It's great to hear about his off-the-screen stuff, too. And then you have Godfather 2 and the growing star power of Al Pacino. And, of course, this also new generation of directors like Francis Ford Coppola, and sort of the way that they view the world and how that started to change Hollywood and still is all these years later.
Right. I mean, as I said, the movies, like television, engaged with the world around them to an incredible extent. Really started with Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate in '67, and then the kind of the tipping point, Easy Rider in '69. But the incredible outpouring of movies in the early 1970s, Carnal Knowledge, Five Easy Pieces, Chinatown, Godfather 1, Godfather 2, The Candidate, a little later, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest Network. I mean, all of these movies, like the TV shows, believed that they could comment on the society around them. And one reason why the early 1970s is considered, along with the late 30s and early 40s, one of the two great periods in Hollywood history is that, as you noted, there were two distinct generations of directors producing much of their greatest work. You had an older generation like Robert Altman and Roman Polanski and Mike Nichols, who had been waiting for these doors to open. You know, who were kind of, you know, grinding away in the more formulaic stuff that both TV and movies did in the 1960s. And then you had the first movies by the directors born in the 40s, the movie brats, Spielberg, Scorsese, George Lucas, Brian De Palma. It's an incredible assemblage of talent. And I say they were almost like shooting volleys across the canyons back and forth at each other.
Let's talk about the music, because it was kind of crazy that almost all these guys were living like 1 or 2 blocks away from each other. Laurel Canyon, right? We have the Eagles were huge at this point, ended up releasing soon after one of the biggest selling albums of all time. We also had Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young going on a big tour in 1974. Joni Mitchell was at sort of the height of her power, too, and also involved with a lot of these guys as well. Jackson Browne was very successful at this point. Your book is titled based off of one of his songs, of course. And then you especially get into Linda Ronstadt, who I think may be the most interesting character in your book. Let's listen to some of Linda's singing. I mean, she was so good, but she had a real struggle at this point.
She was, first of all, she was not only an incredible talent, she was maybe, along with Angelica Houston, the most perceptive observers of the scene. I mean, she really had a great understanding of other people, and she's just a really interesting and smart and perceptive person. Yeah, I mean, Linda Ronstadt, it's interesting. I mean, she came out here in the 60s. She had an early hit with, you know, with her band, the Stone Ponies, but then really, for years, kind of was grinding gears. She was, like many in LA music in that period, she was trying to find a new synthesis between country and rock and rhythm and blues. And the record companies really didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't until she connected with Peter Asher in 1974, which is her breakthrough year. It was also the breakthrough year for the Eagles with their third album, On the Border. The biggest hit for Jackson Browne, his album that year, and Joni Mitchell, her biggest hit ever. It really was the apex of it. Was the moment when the Southern California sound really dominated the music conversation.
So when we talk about Linda Ronstadt, we also should mention her boyfriend at the time. Some people may have heard of him. He became the governor of California in 1974. The youngest governor in California history. Of course, we now know him as the oldest governor in California history. Jerry Brown, just 36 years old then.
And won his primary 2 weeks before the release of Chinatown, both against the backdrop of Watergate and a sense of pervasive corruption that he very, very successfully ran against as one of the first candidates anywhere in the country who brought that same critique of American life that emerged in the 60s that I talked about in pop culture. He brought it into the political arena. Him and Gary Hart in '74 really are the first ones.
And, of course, still impacting California politics to this day as well. All right, up next, we're going to have some fun on this show. We play a game called Personal Issues, so we're going to get to know some of your favorites. But let's go to break with some more music from this era. Crosby, Stills, and Nash take us to break. Stay with us. We are back with Ron Brownstein. We play a game on this show called Personal Issues. This is where we get to know you. We put 30 seconds up on the clock. You talk about a lot of other people's favorites in this book, Rock Me on the Water. Now we get to know your favorites, okay? So here we go. You ready to go?
Ready.
Let's do it. Favorite TV show?
All in the Family, I think.
What is your favorite book?
Master of the Senate, can't beat that, and Cavalier and Clay on the fiction side.
What about movie? Favorite movie?
Godfather, Chinatown, It's a Wonderful Life.
Who's your favorite sports team?
Red Sox.
What's your favorite musical artist or band?
Springsteen.
Oh, good choice there. And who is your role model?
You know, everyone would love to be Robert Caro, but that's beyond reach of us mere mortals. I would say actually Peter Gammons. The way he covered sports always inspired me to how I wanted to cover politics. But I think the person I've followed whose tracks most clearly is Tom Edsall.
And who is that? For people
Tom
that
Edsall
don't know?
is a great journalist and author from the Washington Post in the 80s and 90s, and now writes a column in the New York Times. He pioneered thinking about politics through the lens of demographics and social change, which is what I've tried to do over these last 30, almost 40 years now.
Yeah, and for people that may not know, Robert Caro written extensively about Lyndon Baines Johnson, these amazing books.
Master
and
of the
Peter
Senate.
Gammons for years was on ESPN, talking about baseball and all the rest of it.
Great writer for the Boston Globe, yeah.
All right, so in the spirit of your book,
Yes.
Rock Me on the Water, about 1974, we go to one of the big hits from 1974. We end with the Eagles, Best of My Love. It's a great song. Ron, thank you so much for coming on. This was so fun. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week with more of The Issue Is. Until then, take it away, guys.
Sweet darling, you get the best of my love. You get the best of my